so that we can send a link later on. Okay, now we're good. All right, back to the presentation. So my learning journey started at the age of 6 or 7, like most of us, but it still continues. First picture on the left is me at the age of 7 going to school. And then the other picture is 30 years later, at the age of 37, I'm still at school. I started with industrial engineering, and then I started industrial management in Iran before I came to Switzerland, to EPFL, to do my PhD in management of technology. It was an interdisciplinary research between management and, I would say, industrial engineering, some systems applications in industrial engineering. Then I decided to delve deeper into the world of systems and system dynamics. I did a second master's in system dynamics at WPI. And finally, now I am a student of depth psychology. So I'm a psychoanalyst in training at Jung Institute in Kusnacht. So what I'm going to talk about is a mixture of different ideas from different places, along with my learning journey. So my interest in systems thinking began with the book, The Fifth Discipline, when I was at school, at university. I was not very keen on studying. I was not enthusiastic about the courses. I could not connect them to the reality I was facing outside of work, because I started working as an industrial engineer pretty early when I was a student. I had this opportunity to work in a car manufacturing company in Iran. So I couldn't connect anything I was going through at university with what I was actually facing at work. Finally, I had a course which was called systems thinking, in which this book was introduced, and I started reading this book for the first time. Things started to make sense for me. So that fueled my interest in systems thinking, and my journey of learning more about it started from that point. Nowadays in academia, we are facing an age of hyper specialization. We have 8,000 different disciplines, above 8,000 different disciplines, 50,000 different scientific journals, and over 1 million. I think this statistics is probably not updated now. It's probably 2 million articles published annually. So in the world, we have this, let's say, overall tendency of things getting interconnected and interrelated and combined, as we can see, for instance, with Corona, how we saw that things that were probably distant in time and space were actually very close. We saw that the existing boundaries that we thought existed actually did not exist. So we are witnessing more and more interconnections and interrelationships and combinations in the world, in the trends that are emerging. But at the same time, in our education, we are moving towards more of specialization, isolation, and separation. So there's a great divide between what is happening in the world, especially these days, and what is happening in education. This is something that I cannot wrap my head around. It's funny because if you go back to literature, you can see that this is a part of a book written by John Steinbeck in, I think, early 50s. And he actually is making a point in the 50s about the same problem in a novel, in a work of fiction. So he's talking about one of the characters in the book, that he saw a time when one man would know only one little fragment, but he would know it well. Maybe the knowledge is too great, and maybe men are growing too small. Maybe kneeling down to atoms, they are becoming atom-sized in their souls. Maybe a specialist is only a coward afraid to look out of his little cage and think what any specialist misses, the whole world over his fence. So he was warning about specialization in 50s. And now I think things have gone, things are moving towards hyper specialization. I always give this analogy of an IKEA furniture that it comes in components and parts, and then there's an instruction assembly, how to put the parts together. But unfortunately, if you take, for instance, a business program in which you have organizational behavior, in which you talk about empowerment of employees, then you have marketing, you talk about creating value for the customers. Then we have, for instance, finance, in which we talk about shareholder value maximization. So there are different objectives, different constituencies. If you optimize for one of these constituencies, you will sub-optimize for the others. But there is no, let's say, transcendent function, or let's say something that could create coherence between these dissonant elements that we are exposed to in education. We don't have an instruction assembly. And more importantly, some of these parts will not fit. As I said, if you optimize for one, you'll sub-optimize for some other groups of constituencies. That's the problem that we are facing right now. In many programs that exist, there is no coherent whole that underlies the different elements of the program. You can see it also in the goals that are set. If you think about the SDGs, there's all these 17 different areas and 169 sub-goals. But what is important here, how these areas connect, because if you do something about education, it's going to change a lot of things about gender equality, it's going to change a lot of things about poverty, and so on and so forth. So we are very good at digging down silos and building up pillars, but when it comes to connecting them together, we have a tough time. And I love this quote from Alfred North Whitehead. It says, "The result of teaching small parts of a large number of subjects is the passive reception of disconnected ideas." That's beautiful, beautifully said. Again, this goes back to early 20th century. So these are ideas that we have somehow forgotten and ignored. The passive reception of disconnected ideas. I think it pretty much sums up very well what the education is doing now. Passive reception of disconnected ideas. Then he suggests, let the main ideas which are introduced in education be few and important, and let them be known into every combination possible. That's beautiful. So first, understand how two things relate. Explore all different interrelationships before you adding the third element. Before you adding the fourth, you add the fourth element. This is beautifully said. In my classes, I run this experiment. I gave 2 bottles of water with some building bricks to my students, and I asked them to build a bridge that can hold the weight of the bottles and can actually let the bottles pass underneath it. And almost always, very quickly, students erect the towers, the pillars, and then they ask me, "Excuse me, how can we connect?" And I tell them, well, that is the task. The bridge is the connection, is not the pillars. So we can build them quickly, but as you are building the pillars, you have to think about the connection between them. You cannot postpone connecting them until you have built the pillars. You have to think about them. So once they understand that, they can build things that can hold the weight of more than 2 bottles. But that's a very important message, that as you're building, you have to think about the connections. Before you add the next piece of brick, you have to think about the weight that this whole thing is going to withstand. Now, some ideas about systems. The word system, I don't like to define the word system. I want to introduce you to a conceptual space where the word system can fit. We know about analysis and synthesis. Analysis is breaking things down, like the examples of the SDG that I showed you. We know about energy and synergy. Energy, we're familiar with, and synergy, we know when things are combined in a way that create some, let's say, holistic properties that cannot be traced down to the elements that create them. Like, for instance, I always show this picture in my classes and ask my students if they know what the picture on the right is. And I'm almost always surprised by the fact that they don't know the band Pink Floyd. And it just reminds me that, well, probably there's a generation gap happening now. So I tell them that this is a great album, great rock album. Many people possess this album. If you listen to the drum track, nothing is special about it. Bass track, nothing is special. Vocal lines, nothing is special. Guitar harmonies, nothing is special. you combine them together, suddenly they take on properties that make it the best rock record ever, one of the best rock records ever. And a painter, an Italian painter, puts it beautifully. Giuseppe Arcimboldo, he says, I paint fruits and vegetables, people see the faces. So in systems, we also have this emergence that you put two things together and then something emerges out of it that does not relate back to the, let's say, constituent elements. So this is analysis and synthesis. Then we have sign versus symbol. A sign points to a very specific meaning. A symbol participates in creation of a meaning that has multiple layers and multiple, let's say, ways of understanding. It points to that which is bigger than itself. No, you can never see anyone looking at a no smoking sign and pondering about secrets of life and just looking at it. It's just meant to mean one thing. That's a sign. But symbol points to something which is enlivening, probably energizing. Now, why am I talking about this? Because if you look on the left-hand side, we have analysis, energy, and sign. On the right-hand side, we have synthesis, synergy, and symbol. They all start with the letters S and Y. And this prefix means putting things together, bringing things together, creating a whole. And the word system also fits that bill. So system is a word like that as well. It means to put something, to create a whole. And I just put it as opposed to science, which is about digging and maintaining some variables constant, understanding the effect of two things only. That's how science operates, controlled experiments. Now, as we said, SY means creating wholeness. And the idea behind wholeness is also an ancient idea. You know, in Iran, we have this poet, it's called Sa'di. He has this very famous poem, which is written also at the United Nations, that he says human beings are members of a whole in creation of one essence and soul. If one member is afflicted with pain, other members uneasy will remain. If you have no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you cannot retain. So what he's saying is that we all belong to something which is bigger. You're not, it's just like members of a body. If you have pain in your head, automatically your hand is going to somehow try to relieve that pain. If something happens to your hand, the other hand is going to help. So he says that this analogy of a body applies to human beings. So this wholeness is something that the idea of wholeness existed for a long time. And in literature, this is back to 13th century. And the word health itself comes from a root that means health, that means wholeness. So somehow wholeness and health, they have they share an etymology. So if you can have elements of wholeness, or if you are living a life that is, its purpose is achieving wholeness, then health will be a byproduct. You've heard the story of the blind man and the elephant. Unfortunately, what we try to do is to put broken fragments of a mirror together in order to create a reflection. And this doesn't work. What we need to do is to understand the whole before we understand the parts. And this is very well said by Christopher Alexander in a book that he's written about architecture. Amazing book. And he says he's proposing a new approach to building buildings. And he says within this process, every individual act of building is a process in which space gets differentiated. It is not a process of addition in which performed parts are combined to create a whole, but a process of unfolding, like the evolution of an embryo, in which the whole precedes the parts and actually gives birth to them by splitting. So we have to see the whole first before we go on and we understand the parts. This is something that exists in some practices in architecture, beside it literature. There is a beautiful piece of poetry from T.S. Eliot. He says it in the most beautiful way possible. That is, in the second part, it says, "Where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge?" That's beautiful. Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? if you look at data science, the way we try to work is we get data, we analyze data, we get information, we interpret information, we get knowledge. And then through these cycles, wisdom will emerge. But what he's saying is that when you are looking at information, ask yourself, where is the knowledge that is lost here? It's an unfolding process. It's not an addition process that you start from the fragmented pieces and you put them together with the hope that something is going to emerge, a perfect, let's say, reflection is going to emerge. Now that we know some semantic space of systems and wholeness, what I want to talk a little bit about is some of the things that systems thinkers like to do a lot. And first of all is finding meaningful similarities across seemingly different phenomena. This is something very important. And again, if we go back to our education and our childhood, we see what we have been trained is to see meaningless differences. You know, from childhood, there is all these games you play. There's 2 images. Okay, find the 7 differences. Only a genius can find 3 differences. Okay, I found, for instance, that this line on the tail of the fox doesn't exist. All right, so what right now? How am I more enlightened compared to a few minutes ago? How did it help me? What do I know now that I didn't know? So these are the things that are embedded in our upbringing and development and education, unfortunately, seeing differences. No one trains us for seeing meaningful similarities. Now, in the book Scale by Jeffrey West, he does a great job of finding meaningful similarities across seemingly different phenomena. He looks at mammals. You say, you know, we have the shrew, which is the smallest mammal. Then we have the elephant and the whale. To the biggest mammal, they look very different. You know, the biologist looks at them. They can distinguish at least 120 different types of shrews that exist. You can find all these differences between different types of shrews. But for a systems thinker, he looks at these, Jeffrey West, and says, what is the meaningful similarity here? He says, no matter where you come from, what type of mammal you are, the total number of heartbeats you have in your lifetime is more or less the same across all the mammals. This is amazing. Because I always felt sad when I heard that a dog dies at the age of 13 or 14 and stuff. And then I realized that a year for us is 7 years for the dogs because their heartbeat is faster. So the measure of life is not years. The measure of life is heartbeat, something that we all miss. When you are stuck at a traffic light, we get stressed for like 2 minutes. I have to stop at this traffic light. Oh my God, how can I do this? And we bring our heartbeat up. So the 2 minutes is nothing compared to the number of heartbeats that you're losing because of the stress that is running through your system. So you see a similarity now across seemingly different phenomena, which is meaningful. Say, okay, all right, then I have to work on my heartbeat. What do I do? Probably if I do some sports, some meditation, that's going to help me with the stress reduction. So that's one example of a systems thinking, let's say, approach that we lack and we need a lot these days. Another one, recently, a friend of mine sent me a link and she told me, hey, you know, there's this link and most of the movies that you talk about, because I always talk about the stuff that, let's say, excites me with other people, that most of the movies you're talking about is on this link. I checked it out and it was correct. It was spot on. And those movies, they all had something in common that I didn't know even. For instance, the one on the top left is called The Third Man. Then we have Apocalypse Now, then Space Odyssey, 2001 Space Odyssey, and The Night of the Hunter. They are made in different years by different directors. They're in different genres, different actors. There is nothing in common between these movies if you are looking at them from the face values. But if you go down from that level, I realized that based on the video that I watched, they all are aesthetically pleasing. There are movies that every frame of this movie is a painting. And so, oh my God. So the thing that is driving me in my interest in watching movies is actually the visual aesthetics that is playing an important role for me. I didn't know that beforehand. I just had this weird bunch of movies together that I really loved. They are also very good on different dimensions, from cinematography to acting to casting to whatever, you name it. But there is something, there's a thread that weaves them all. And I realized that day. One other example that I learned from psychoanalysis is that if you look at all these fairy tales, there's something in common between them. And the thing is, the mother of the hero or the heroine is missing. She's not there. It's the absence of mother. Either she's dead, either she's left, or we don't even know what has happened to her. She's not there for whatever reason. So there's this absence of feminine energy that connects like a thread all these fairy tales that have emerged in different cultural regions in the world. And then the question is, what does it signify? Now, that's the similarity. What's the meaning of that? Because then there has to be a profound meaning for this absence of feminine energy. So that was another example of finding meaningful. I'm not going to tell you what that is, so you have to think about it yourself or probably do some digging to figure it out, but it's worth the digging. I promise you that. So that was basically another standpoint. Now, if you look at all these methods that are exercised or taught in business schools especially, they also have one thing in common. They are super simplified, superficial simplifications of the reality. All of them have a number in their name, you know, either 5 forces or 4 Ps or 9 blocks on business model canvas. So they're all trying to create this illusion that you have learned how to, let's say, understand the complexity or tame the complexity of a decision situation. So this is something that is also a meaningful similarity across all these methods. So the focus here is ease of memorization, then practicality of the insights that are generated. How easily it can be memorized, how fast people can get hooked on these things. But is it practical? Is it useful? That's the question. And I like this story at the beginning of a book on software engineering. I always tell it to my students, is that there was a man in New York City who was selling a product known as the guaranteed cockroach killer. When you bought this, he would send to you 2 blocks and a set of instructions, which was place cockroach on block A and then hit cockroach with block B. That's the guaranteed way of killing the cockroach. So most of these methods that we have are actually like that. They talk about things. Okay, you choose your goals, and with respect to the situation, formulate the problem, the gap between the desired and the actual situation. Based on that, formulate a decision, put your decision to action, and you'll get the results. Very nice, but the only thing is that these steps are not actionable. It's a guaranteed cockroach kill. It's a guaranteed problem solver, I would say. But in reality, you know that when you have goals, there's an environment involved, there's actions of others, there are side effects, unintended consequences, and a lot of other things. There is different patterns of behavior that will emerge based on your decisions that you will not possibly understand beforehand. So we have, let's say, static minds in a dynamic world. We have linear mode of thinking in a non-linear world of phenomena around us. All of those methods that you look, they are linear. They are static snapshots of situation. But in reality, we have events and phenomena that unfold over time, and none of these relationships that exist in nature are linear. You cannot find a linear relationship in nature. So, well, I'll just quickly go over that thing. Next point before that, I just want to see if anyone has a question or a pressing concern, anything you want to know before I continue. If not, well, I can see some of you here there's multiple pages, but if there's nothing, I'll just go ahead with the rest of the presentation. And I try to finish in 10 to 15 minutes so that we can have probably a conversation afterwards as well, if possible. Okay, now, from this mode of, from a reactive mode, we have to move towards a transformative mode as well. So systems thinking is also there to help us with this. I always ask the students, do you know where the keyboard that we're using comes from in our phones? That's exact keyboard that existed on the typewriters. So when there was a mechanical function, there a mechanical key and a mechanical function. Then we have the keyboards on our laptops. There is mechanical keys, but the function is not mechanical anymore, it's digital. And then we have the phones in which none of them are mechanical. So did the designer of the typewriter keyboard see it all coming hundreds of years ago? He could see that and design something that could optimize across multiple devices with different specificities. Is it the case? Or there is something else there that happened? Where do these things come from? The fact that we can see an iPhone with a QWERTY keyboard is an event, basically. Then if you can see this keyboard layout exists across different platforms, that's a trend, that's a pattern. Then where does that design come from? That's the question. And the underlying layer is the mental model, those decision rules or the design principles that the designer used to create that design. So if you go down this iceberg, you will be able to move from reaction to transformation. Most of the times, most of the initiatives that we have are more similar to firefighting in a reactive mode, to things that are popping up there. Just try to find a very quick solution to those things. Whereas the leverage, the real leverage lies in the shift of mental models. Then when I started my studies in psychology, I realized that, oh my God, this iceberg is much bigger than that. There's a big layer underneath that. That's where the thoughts are coming from. So where do our thoughts coming from? That's a very important question. Because again, if we're at the level of thoughts, that's good improvement, but that's just more like 20% of what we need to cover. Now, finally, I think systems thinking is not a science, is not an art, is not a craft. It's all the three at the same time. It's a way for us to hone our intuition. There's an art dimension to it. If two systems thinkers look at a situation, they can build completely different models. So we're not force-fed with templates in systems thinking or ready to use or off-the-shelf methods. In systems thinking, we learn ways of conceptualizing a problem. And with those tools for conceptualization, we can conceptualize problems in different ways. And that's the art. Exactly like two painters looking at a landscape and each of them coming up with their own representation of what they see over there. There's an art dimension to systems thinking that I really appreciate. At the same time, it helps us, it provides us with tools based on which we can learn from our experiences. Craft iteration is basically learning from experience. So it can help us refine our thought patterns and our experiences. And finally, there is science embedded in it because there are elements in systems thinking that come from nonlinear dynamics, from control engineering, from electrical engineering. The models that we produce there, the quantitative models in which we hypothesize and we measure. So in my opinion, in the practice of systems thinking, there is a good balance between the artistic, the craft, and the scientific dimensions. And finally, we need this shift of mind, this metanoia, as Greeks said it, that I've summed up here with some questions. The questions are, how can we see meaningful similarities across seemingly different phenomena? One thing that we discussed. So from now on, let's not discard things because they look irrelevant. Let's just keep them to see if, let's say, a third thing emerges that can connect these two things. That's systems thinking. You just hold this tension of opposites in your mind until there's a shift of mind and you can look at them and you can see some similarities across them. How can I connect phenomena that are distant in time and space? These non-existing boundaries, you know, that something happening in some other country does not really influence me, that I'm here, that we really felt it with Corona. How can I learn how to learn? Instead of taking in and memorizing ready-made pieces of, let's say, information, chunks of information ready for us, how can I learn how to learn? How can I move away from event-level interventions to transformative ones? So interventions that are more reactive to those that are more transformative and you have a higher leverage. How can I reflect on how I think? How can I think about the way I think? And like I told you, this whole thing started more like an accident last week. So I was not planning on organizing this myself, but it didn't work because of some technical problems we faced. And then I thought to myself, now that I'm presenting this, it's also a good initiative to introduce an online course that I want to start offering for the first time out of universities, because so far I've been identified with different universities and this course has been offered within the framework of existing courses at universities. Now I want to offer it more as myself to those who are interested in attending. So I called it Systems Thinking, A Journey into the Wild, in which I somehow focus on the topics that we some more or less discussed here, but in more depth. And I have envisioned 6 interactive live sessions on Zoom. So it's not anything recorded, pre-recorded material. It's interactive. So it's 600 minutes of training, probably weekly. Limited number of participants. I'm thinking something around 10 people maximum in one group. The idea is not to move towards a mass production of education, is to keep it very small scale, at the same time very transformative, in which in each session we'll have some, let's say, material for participants to read, to prepare, some organizing questions for them to approach the readings, some movies to watch. Movies are great sources of learning in my opinion, and to relate them to the readings. And then they can also bring examples and cases from their own practice. And I've thought about some basic ideas that could be included in those sessions. And I will send you, let's say, a quick link to this in case you're interested to know more. You can sign up, and then we can have another session in which I will talk about this in more detail. And my colleagues at University of Business and International Studies have agreed to also issue a certificate for participants at the end of the training. For those of you who want to have a proof that you've also gone through some training, that's also a possibility that you can get a certificate of attendance for this. So anyways, that was more or less the topics I wanted to share with you today evening. And this picture that I started with is the picture inside a wind catcher in Yazd, a province of Iran. And Yazd is located in a desert. And people in the desert learned systems thinking probably before those who lived in areas in which the weather conditions were not as harsh, because they learned how to tame the nature. They could catch the wind, bring it in, use it as a natural ventilation system. And they also had a modern way of digging down to reach the subterranean water. So they were using the water at the, let's say, layers deeply embedded in the earth, and then at the same time using the air to chill their homes. So I thought this is a very good example of systems thinking in practice. And as you can see, there's also an aesthetic dimension to it that we cannot deny. So as usual, my aesthetic side picked on that image as well. So that is basically what I wanted to share with you today. I will stop sharing the slides. I'll send you the recording, the link to the recording after the presentation, so that you can rewatch it if it's something you would like to do. And right now, I think the floor is open for you to ask questions if you want to know something more about systems thinking. If you have some concerns, questions, we can have like 20 minutes of questions and answers. I'll look at the chat box for the questions, so feel free to post your questions in the chat box if there is something you want to know. And I'm going to stop the recording here.